Alright guys, we're gonna dive into engraving this slotted concho, and I'll start with the flowers. Sometimes if you need to kind of work your way through what the game plan is here, most likely if you're doing this you drew it, so you already kind of know what the game plan is, but I'm gonna give these flowers some separation, and this will be a petal, this will be a petal. You know, you get the gist of that. Again, like I said, if you draw it, you already know what you got going on. These little lobes and some curves. And what we're going to try to do is give them a little bit of dimension and make them look, you know, good. So, you could do this with a polished V-graver. I usually do Western stuff, bridal bits, conchos, things like that. I'll usually start off with a flat graver on these, and I'm just going to kind of define my edges. Probably a little different than say gun engraving is everything's not a precise cut, it's kind of a suggestion of. And you can kind of tell that it just starts to separate some things out a little bit. I want to roll the edge of that. And here's what I meant by everything's not a precise cut is, let me go to the microscope. When I make this cut right here, I don't have to start right where the last cut ended. I'm just going to let the curve of those cuts kind of bump into each other, and it'll give the suggestion of that being a lobe. So here I'm going to start way down here low, and just make sure that I bump that as I go by, so to speak. And by letting that cut start a little bit lower, it kind of automatically added a lobe to that leaf. Now, here I've got it penciled in to where this edge of the petal is going to be higher or in front of this petal. So I'll cut this short on the top side, and then whenever I put this line in, again, it's going to be that whole suggestion thing. And I'm just going to make sure that I bump the end of this cut as I go by. So again, one of those situations where we'll just bump it as we go by. It doesn't have to be a precise cut. We just want this curve to bump into that curve. And if you go through there and it doesn't, leaves that little plain spot, just nip it off. Another suggestion cut. And that's pretty much got our flower boxed in, minus the shading. Now when we go to shade it, we'll put some foldovers in the leaves and kind of jazz it up a little bit. But that gives the general idea. And then when we look at the scroll work, we've got kind of a loop in it right here to where one thing is in the front and one thing's in the back. So we'll have to determine, as this comes through here and loops around and goes on, we'll have to determine which one we want to be on the top and which one we want to be on the bottom. So whichever one I want on the top, I'm just going to scribe in its line so I know to cut those. So we'll let that one be on the top. So this is a pretty simple little scroll element, so it's not real hard to keep up with. But what I'm going to do is start with my flat. Come right on around with that. And I'll bevel the edge of this leaf lobe that's right here. And moving right along, I'll catch this other line. Now notice that I'm lining my tool up because I know that when I get to this open edge right here, I want to be beveling from that direction. So riding on the corner of that tool, and then as I get here, I'm going to go ahead and separate this out. It's ideal that you make these cuts in one long sweeping motion, but if you need to stop and reposition your hand, then do so. But don't try to start back cutting from right there where you stop. Scoot back a little bit. Kind of gives you a run and start at it, so to speak, and you'll be able to make that transition a lot smoother. And then from there, it's very similar to what we were doing on the flower petals. Bevel there. There's going to be a split in the leaf, but I'm going to exaggerate it just a little bit. And once again, we'll do the whole suggestion thing. We'll suggest that that was a lobe. And now we've kind of got that roughed in. And then we'll just work our way all the way around. Here, we don't want to leave a smooth spot right there. So I want to bevel this edge, but I'm going to back up and start inside this line that I already did. And I'm going to drift out of it over to that edge, so you can see it makes that separation between this leaf and the edge of this leaf. Now on our loop, you can see I just kind of randomly started in somewhere. And the reason for that is a lot of times whenever you try to make a tight turn like this, your graver will create heel drag. But if you'll come at it from two different directions, you can oftentimes avoid getting that heel drag as you try to go all the way around the corner, or all the way around the loop, I guess would be more accurate. And that process is pretty much going to repeat itself real quick on that coming from two different directions. Right about here in beveling this leaf is where things are going to get really tight, and I'm going to have a lot of trouble making that curve without having heel drag, even though I've got my heel radius a bit. It'll help you do this cleaner. if you know that spot's coming, you go to about right there and stop, and then come back and get it from the other side. We don't have to worry too much about the very tip of that leaf, because we're going to easily be able to get that when we come through from this direction and bevel the top. So that same approach or thought process is going to take place all over the concho, and then we'll come back and shade. Now, this can be a little bit tricky, but if you look at our loop, you need to be able to visualize that that loop comes right on here, and that this is simply a leaf that spun off of that scroll. So that just separates that leaf out. And now that simple little scroll element is ready for foldovers and shading. And I'll go ahead and catch the other side up, but you can kind of see what's beginning to happen there. And this will be what we end up with. So off to the other side, and I'll get it beveled and caught up. Alright, so we got all the edges beveled here, and you can kind of see what we're working with so far. And what we want to do now is go into the microscope view, and let's start adding a little bit of pizzazz to the flowers. So you want to attack this one petal at a time. And what I think we might want to do here is maybe we want to come around and put a little fold over in that leaf. A little hard to get to because of this apparatus that I have holding the concho. You can see that slip, that scratch right there. A pretty common question that people ask is, well, how do you get rid of that? What can you do to fix that? And the answer is a burnisher. Now, this is just a polished piece of carbide. It looks sharp, but it's not. It is to a point, but it's not sharp. And you just want to rub with that scratch in the same direction of the scratch. And now the scratch is gone. What you see is a burnished area. And usually I don't bother with it from there, but just for the sake of showing you guys that that scratch is in fact gone, I can just take a little abrasive, and you can see that in fact there is no scratch there. It's been completely cleaned up. Now I could continue polishing on that, but there's not any point in it, because I'm going to end up polishing it after it's all finished, so no need in doing the same work twice. So here I'm going to add a little fold over on the leaf here. And maybe on this other lobe we're not going to worry so much about a fold over, but we're going to give the illusion of some depth by taking just a few cuts and putting them there. What that kind of does is creates the illusion of a low spot, or that's physically a low spot, I guess, but a low spot here as if this is higher. And again, unlike gun engraving, a lot of things you do here are just a suggestion. And a lot of people think that fold overs are just something that you do for decoration, and I mean, and yes it is, but oftentimes you'll use a fold over as a technique to allow you to shade from a different direction. In other words, these shade lines will be cut in this direction toward the center of the flower. The exception to that is when you have a fold over and you're going to shade into the darkness or into where the shadow would be. And because I got this big galoot right here in my way, it's a lot easier for me to reach if I shade from this direction. So I put a fold over there, and that allows me to change the direction that I shade in. I want to cut thin to thick, parallel lines. And the only reason that they appear to merge is because the line gets wider as it gets to the top. In other words, if you look at the trajectory of this tool, it's straight, 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 all straight. But when I cut them, because I'm going from thin or from shallow to deep, as I get deeper, it widens that cut and causes them to bump into each other. Again, in steel, you have a lot more resistance in your material, and those end up a little bit cleaner. In silver, it's got a lot of stretch to it, and you may have to go back and make a pass to clean up your ditch a little bit, for lack of a better way of saying it. But then you kind of start to see the effect that that has on that leaf. Back here, you can see I need to do a little bit of cleanup work right there, but again, I'm not big for doing the same job twice. So as I cut a few shade lines up underneath that fold over, or shade into the darkness, if you will, as I clean up my leftovers, I'll kind of automatically have an opportunity to clean that up just a little bit. And what putting those fold overs there allows me to do is now, with this thing in my way, whenever I go to shade the bottom portion of the leaf, I can at least reach it now over this jig that's holding my concho. And we'll call that petal shaded. If you want, you can go back and add a little bit of cross hatching. If you just want to keep it to where it'll hold a little bit more color, but perhaps a little bit darker. But be careful with that, because it's not hard to overdo. And we'll do one more leaf together, and then I think you'll get the gist of it. It's, you know, again, it's the same thing over and over again, leaf per leaf. I think we'll put a fold over along this edge. Try to get you guys in focus a little bit better. So put a fold over there. We know that the stem of this comes back to the center of the flower, and we'll want to use that trajectory as we cut these shade lines. Even though we're shading into the fold over, we'll want to put that sweeping arc in them that's consistent with the direction that all of this grew. And then we'll clean up our fuzzies. And maybe put, let's not put a fold over in this top lobe. Let's just put about 3 accent cuts, because, you know, this is a concho. We don't have the luxury of spending 20 hours engraving one concho. Now, notice that the shape of those, almost as if it's just an echo of this line right here. Same trajectory on all of those lines. And we turn this leaf around, where I've made that little scratch line, or that scribe line, that lets us know that our path of travel to the center is going to be this direction right here. And every single line that we cut will share that same path of travel. So we're going to vary these, maybe a short one and then a long one. And then we can go back and put in some cross hatches. And that process is just going to repeat itself from leaf to leaf to leaf. So no need in watching paint dry. And then we'll do some of the shading on the leaves of the scroll elements. Flower. And we're just going to do some cross hatch. Pop, 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 pop. Now you can carry that cross. Alright guys, so shading scrolls can be as simple as you'll let it be. And if you guys have seen the drawing class, you already know this, but every single one of these cuts, or every single one of these lobes, is going to have an imaginary line where it travels back to where it grew from. And it doesn't matter what element you're shading, that gives you all of the information that you could possibly need to effectively shade any leaf. You can go up here to this leaf, same situation. This lobe, this line has to trace back all the way to its origin. Now this one's origin is going to be a little tough to see because there's going to be a fold over right there. But maybe don't bother yourself with that. Let's just focus on everything going back to origin. And we're going to shade light to dark. So we're going to be cutting in this direction. Unless it's a fold over, of course. In which case we'll be cutting into this direction. You're going to shade into the darkness. And the thickness of the backbone is a no-fly zone. You don't want to put any shading here. There are exceptions to that situation because we want to show this coming out from behind the flower, so we may put a few shade lines right here and crosshatch just to give that some darkness and in an attempt to add a little bit of depth to it. So let's go ahead and put a fold over in this leaf, or in this lobe of this leaf, and all I'm going to do is exaggerate that line just like that, which gives us the ability to shade this direction. And we're going to echo this main line right here. So whatever that arc is, we're going to follow it. Cutting these lines parallel, they may not look that way because they go from thin to heavy. But that's simple, and it's a fold over. Now this next lobe, I don't want to go all out and put a full fold over on it, but we'll try to give it some depth by making a few cuts here that will hold a little bit of dark color when we antique the concho. And then out at the tip of the leaf we can put a small fold over. Now I'm just copying that S that's at the top of that leaf. Maybe I'm exaggerating it just a little bit, but the shape of this cut is just about the same. Now we can shade back up into this direction, but we need to respect the radius or the arc, the path of travel, if you will, that goes all the way back to origin. And if you need to scratch a little line on there, then scratch a little line on there. That's going to let you know how to set your hands on the vise and position yourself so that you can easily make that same arc repeatedly. And then if you got any little fuzzies or burrs, if you want to call them that, you can go back and recut that line. Now, if everything is curving this way, in this direction, then we want our cross hatches to oppose that curve. These are curving this direction, so we want our cross hatch to oppose that. Or, because it's a fold over, we can come up and just pick a different angle and just lightly shade into that. And that will take care of the fold overs. Now we want to do our main shade lines, or our growth shading. And they're going to follow, just like rain running down the leaf. They're going to follow that line, or echo that main line at the bottom. Now, where we put those little light scribe lines showing that each base of the lobe is headed in the direction where it grew from, that's your telltale that you're not going to put any cut where that is. That's going to become the highlight of your leaf. Now, I'm not doing any super fine shading on this just because it's silver and, you know, it's a concho, not a gum. But that doesn't change the fact that you do still want to honor the rules of growth. You can see there was no shading cut there. That'll end up being a highlight. We're out of room. We've got a line here that's no man's land. No shade goes there because that is the imaginary growth line of the bottom of this lobe. So we'll go into the center section. We can only put a couple of them in there, and we only put a couple of them in there. Now we're out of room, so we don't want to put a shade line where that scribe line is. These are going to go all the way back. Now I am infringing a little bit on the backbone space. In other words, the thickness of this, where we scribbled our line for the no man's land. And that's just because, as mentioned, we're going to add a few little cuts here in an attempt to give the illusion of depth where this comes out from behind that flower. And we're just going to do some crosshatch. Pop, 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 pop. Now you can carry that cross-hatching on up the leaf if you want, but as you come out of the darkness or the darkest spot, the base of it, you want your cross-hatches to get a little bit lighter and a little bit further apart. And you don't want to overshade. That can be just as bad as shading wrong. And let me wake up the sleeping camera, and you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. Again, the metal that you're engraving certainly plays a part in how much detail you're going to be able to cram onto something. Silver obviously doesn't offer the same resistance as tool steel, but if you're light-handed with it and you take your time, you can still get a pretty good effect out of it. And you know, obviously things can get as complicated or they can stay as simple as you would like them to be, but that process would repeat itself on all of the leaves. This leaf is a little bit tricky, but what you have to do is whatever you're faced with engraving, again, odds are you drew it, but recognize everywhere there's a lobe is an imaginary growth line. And shade accordingly. No shade line goes where that imaginary growth line is. Play with that a little bit, and I bet you'll like it. So, anyway, hope that helped. Alright, real quick to answer, I think it was Matt Arnold's question, what I was holding that with. This is super not fancy. This is 2 little pieces of heel band material and then a third piece. You really can't see much of the third piece because I stacked all 3 of them together and welded it right there, and then I ground that down as thin as I felt like I could get away with without it breaking. Now if I grab it in the vise, knock some stuff over here. If I grab it in the vise like this, maybe I break it. But if I grab it here and here, I can squeeze it as hard as I want. I don't have to worry about it bending or breaking or anything. And it seemed like 3 pieces of heel band material that were basically 3/16 seemed to fit pretty good inside that concho, just like so. And then making sure I grab it from the sides, I just stick that in, press down on it pretty hard while I tighten the vise. And then it may have a little bit of wiggle, but it's pretty solid. It's certainly good enough to engrave in silver with. So anyway, there you go. That and $1.09 will get you a cup of coffee at the Chevron.